This social studies mini lesson is going to look specifically at amending the Constitution, what that means and how it happens. I'd like to open with a quote from Henry Clay. Now, you may not be familiar with Henry Clay, but he was a major statesman in U.S. history. He was our 7th Speaker of the House. He actually served in the House and the Senate. He ran for president multiple times. He famously helped avert the Civil War a few times. I mean, he couldn't prevent it, but he managed to prevent it from happening in an earlier decade. So here's what Henry Clay had to say about the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States was made not merely for the generation that then existed, in other words, not merely for the people of the 1780s, but for posterity, unlimited, undefined, endless, perpetual posterity. So he's saying this document, though it was written way back, 1787, ratified 1789, this is intended to be a document that will guide the country through the entirety of its life. It's not a document that's only going to apply to the founding generation of this country. So with that in mind, the framers of the Constitution, the 55 men who met in Philadelphia to write this thing and hash things out, knew from the beginning they needed a document that could adapt to a growing, changing country. After all, they'd seen quite a bit of change just in their lifetimes. So they created a way that the Constitution could be updated when necessary. But they made it slow on purpose. Why do you think they made it a slow process? Well, if you think about the context, these people are the survivors of a very messy revolution. The American Revolution was not like some neat, tidy war that we were foreordained to win. It actually was incredibly bloody, costly, and we actually shouldn't have even won it. We were vastly outnumbered. We were, after all, declaring war on the greatest superpower in the entire world at that time. And we somehow stumbled into a victory. I mean, we didn't even have the full support of our own country. Only 1/3 of Americans supported the revolution. So these gentlemen who were meeting in Philadelphia to write a constitution, they have just come through all that. They've seen the rapid change that a revolution brings, and they wanted stability more than anything. They realized that in a government, if change happens too quickly, it can threaten stability. So to them, any fast changes are a scary notion. They want things to happen slowly, methodically, with great thought. And there's both pros and cons to their decision with regard to the rate of change. But that's neither here nor there, because what we're focusing on is amending the Constitution. When has our Constitution needed to be amended? Just for fun, think for a second. In what century, the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, the 2000s, in what century do you think the Constitution needed the greatest amount of amendment? In other words, we needed to make the most changes to the Constitution. Which century? Well, let's find out. So 1700s is when we wrote the Constitution, 1787, and then ratified 1789. And then right off the bat, they did have to make a few tweaks, like, for example, adding the Bill of Rights just a few years later. Now, the 1800s saw a few more changes. Most notably, in the 1800s, there was a massive change to American society when slavery formally ended, because there was a population of about 5 million people, former slaves, who now had to be converted from slaves to citizens. And that, sadly, was not an easy process. It actually took 3 separate constitutional amendments to accomplish that. And it still wasn't perfect. 1900s. Ho ho. Yeah, the 1900s actually saw the greatest number of changes to our Constitution. This is when the bulk of the amendments were written. By the way, how many amendments does our Constitution have? Do you know? Just take a wild guess. If you guessed 27, you are correct. 27 amendments. That includes the Bill of Rights, which comprises the first 10 amendments. Now, constitutional change can happen two separate methods. By formal amendment, there's 4 ways in which to do that, or by other informal means. Let's start by looking at formal amendment. So, formal amendment. What does that actually mean, that term formal amendment? Literally, that means changes that become part of the written language of the Constitution. So, constitutional amendments, like the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. Those are changes to the written language of the Constitution that are codifying or preserving into law certain key changes that we as Americans have determined are necessary, or more specifically, that our government and our representatives have determined are necessary. So changes like giving women the right to vote, or giving the right to vote to 18-year-olds, deciding whether or not income tax is permissible. It requires a 2-step process to formally amend the Constitution. Because remember, this was supposed to be a slow way of effecting change. So first, an amendment has to be proposed. Then an amendment has to be ratified. Ratified is where an amendment is voted on and states will then decide they support the amendment. So there's 2 ways to achieve each of these 2 steps for formal amendment, which means technically there's 4 different routes to creating a constitutional amendment. So what does that process look like? Well, as I said, step 1, an amendment is proposed. How does an amendment get proposed? 2 possible ways it can happen. It can be proposed by Congress by a 2/3 vote in both houses. Now, I'm just going to say that's a pretty tall order. So it's basically going to have to be bipartisan. That's kind of hard. Also, you have to have both the House of Representatives and the Senate accomplish 2/3 of their members agreeing to this in order to propose an amendment. So you can probably see right off the bat why this doesn't happen very often. Now, your other option is actually even harder. So a national convention can be called. The way this works, 2/3 of the state legislatures, which, how many states would that be? If you're doing a little math here, 50 states, 2/3 of that would be 33.333333333, and so on. And so we round it to 34. So 34 states would have to have their governments agree that we need a national convention. They would then request that Congress call a national convention because only Congress has that power. Congress would then call a national convention, basically a huge meeting, and every state would have representatives present. And then at that national convention, a new amendment could be proposed. As you can see, getting the governments of 34 states to agree that this is necessary is a lot harder than getting a 2/3 vote in both houses in Congress. Now, the other step, as if the first step wasn't hard enough, the second step is you have to get an amendment actually ratified or agreed to after it's been proposed. And there's 2 ways we can do this. So the first way is it can be ratified by the state legislatures or the state governments of 3/4 of the states. So that's a pretty big number of states that have to be in agreement. How many states would that be, 3/4 of the United States? All right, so doing a little math here. 50 states. 3/4 of 50 is 37.5, which of course would be rounded up. So 38 states. 38 states have to ratify an amendment for it to become an amendment. Or, the other way you could do this, it could be ratified by conventions held in 3/4 of the states. So basically, whichever way you do it, you're going to have 38 states agree in order to ratify an amendment. Now, going back in American history, when we had fewer states, that would be a smaller number, obviously. But with 50 states, you have to have 38 agree and ratify a constitution. Now, of the two options for how you ratify, it's a lot easier to have the legislatures ratify than to have to hold a convention in each state and have at least 3/4 of the state reach the same conclusion. I mean, because a convention would be a formal meeting with representatives, and there'd be a whole lot more discussion, and along with that, a whole lot more argument. All right, so if you are trying to get an amendment added to the Constitution, you have to do some combination of these options. So you go that way, you go that way, you go that way, that way. There's 4 possible combinations you can make. So again, you could propose by a convention of the states and then ratify by state conventions. That has never been used. Never in American history have we done it that way. It's a lot of work. It's daunting. That's why. You could also have proposal by convention of states and then ratification by state legislatures. Here again, we've never used that option. It's just way too much work. You can do a proposal by Congress and then ratification by state conventions. That has been done once, only once in U.S. history. Again, it's a lot of work when you have to call these conventions because you're getting more people and you have to arrange a time and place for them to meet, and they're going to argue and debate and possibly make a giant mess out of things before they ever come to any decisions. So we've only done it this way once. What typically happens is there's a proposal by Congress and then ratification by the state legislatures. That's the easiest route, and it's not easy at all. So that has been used all other times when we've amended the Constitution. Now, how often has our Constitution needed to be formally amended? Well, if you look at this timeline that breaks U.S. history into 20-year chunks, 1789 is when the U.S. Constitution was ratified. It had been written 2 years earlier, and then it took 2 years to ratify it. And mind you, we didn't have nearly so many states back then. Then, just 2 years later, they added the Bill of Rights. So that would be the 1st through 10th Amendments. And I'll do another video explaining the Bill of Rights and why they felt that was necessary. Then 4 years later, they decided we needed the 11th Amendment. And so that is everything that happened in the 1700s as far as the Constitution was concerned. Well, then you get into the 1800s. 1804, we got the 12th Amendment. And we skip several decades and we come to the 13th Amendment in 1865. And that's the amendment that formally abolishes slavery after the Civil War. Then the 14th Amendment became necessary because just ending slavery wasn't enough for converting this large population into citizens. They needed further governmental protections. So we get 14th Amendment, and that was insufficient. So then we got the 15th Amendment. So over a 5-year period, we had to have 3 separate amendments just so that this chunk of the population could be considered citizens and could have the rights they deserved as citizens. Now, fast forward through American history, we go a while with no further amendments, and then in 1913 we get 2 amendments, one of which is the amendment that grants the government the right to collect income tax, which I know you all love so much. Just kidding. Just a few years later, the 18th Amendment, and then 1920, the 20th Amendment, where women finally get the right to vote. 1933, the 20th and the 21st Amendments. 51, we get the 22nd Amendment. 10 years later, we get the 23rd Amendment. Then a couple years later, the 24th, and a couple years later, the 25th, which the 25th Amendment is the amendment that basically spells out the succession of power for if something happens to the president. Why did we need to establish that in 1967? Well, because just a few years earlier, we had had Kennedy assassinated and had to have power transition to the vice president. And the 60s were a contentious decade with multiple political assassinations. So there was this question of, well, what happens if the president and the vice president were killed? And what happens if the president were somehow unfit for office? We've got to have some policies. Now, obviously you could impeach a president, but what if you need to get rid of a president quicker? Like, what if a president absolutely lost his mind? What if he was mentally unsafe? So we had to spell that out. 71, we get the 26th Amendment. And lastly, 1992, the 27th Amendment. So lots of changes in the 1900s. And basically what happens with the Constitution is we go along for a while, everything's working for us more or less, and then we hit some sort of roadblock and we have to make an amendment for a path forward. So like the example with the Civil War and 5 million people suddenly becoming citizens, you had to have some amendments to make that happen, mainly to offer protections and clarify that these people were supposed to have equal rights. In the 20th century, there were additional challenges. 20th century, by the way, means the 1900s. There were various challenges that hadn't been foreseen, or at least hadn't been widely foreseen. Like those issues of, well, what happens if this situation happens to the president? Or in the case of the 22nd Amendment, how many times should a president actually be allowed to be president? Because George Washington had said twice was enough, and that was basically how most presidents behaved. But then you had a president who actually won 4 terms, Roosevelt. So then there was this question of, well, if a president could get elected 4 times, basically he wouldn't really be a president anymore. He'd be more like a king, and he could potentially become a dictator. So we had to have some kind of protection against that. Hence, an amendment that clarifies a president can only be president twice. Now, as far as the formal amendment process goes, sorry, Mr. President, but you have to sit this one out. At no point does the president play a role in the formal amendment process. Because think about it, that could be very dangerous if presidents were allowed to create amendments to the Constitution. It could be exceedingly bad, especially depending on who the president is at the time. There's actually a Supreme Court case that further makes this a policy, Hollingsworth versus Virginia in 1798. The negative of the president, or the presidential veto, applies only to the ordinary cases of legislation. He has nothing to do with the proposition or adoption of amendments to the Constitution. So the president can veto laws he doesn't like. He cannot veto a constitutional amendment. He can't create a constitutional amendment. Now, it's not to say that he can't do absolutely anything. He just can't formally do anything. He can, or she, someday we're going to get a female president, he or she can make his or her opinion known, but he or she cannot veto anything having to do with the amendment. Here's a good question. Can states change their minds about ratifying amendments? Could a state ratify an amendment and then 10 years later say, oh, nope, we changed our mind. We don't like this amendment anymore? Well, let's see what the Constitution says. What does the Constitution say about this? It doesn't. Oh, well, that's a little bit problematic, isn't it? The Constitution clarifies what the states can do, but it doesn't actually go into what they can't do on the subject of ratifying amendments. Oops. So what has been the policy in the past? Because basically this one depends largely on precedent and kind of some critical thinking. The policy for basically the entirety of American history has been, if a state rejects an amendment, it's not bound by that decision. They can reconsider and ratify later, which is what happened with, for instance, the 13th Amendment. Southern states didn't want to ratify it because they wanted to keep slavery as a policy. But then later, as time went on, they realized, hey, we're on the wrong side of history with this. We really need to catch up and actually ratify the 13th Amendment. If a state ratifies, however, they can't go back on that decision later. And the reason for this policy is because it would create a giant constitutional crisis if they could change their mind about ratifying. I mean, think about it. Let's say you have an amendment pass like the 13th Amendment, where slavery is forbidden within the United States, and you get 38 states. Let's pretend that you need 38 states. Actually, it was far fewer in 1865. But let's say you get 38 states to agree to this amendment that you need. It gets ratified, it goes into the Constitution, people live with this amendment. 10 years later, one state decides, you know what? I changed my mind. I don't like this amendment after all. They revoke it. At that point, you would only have 37 states ratifying the amendment, which is not enough states. Therefore, the amendment would basically have to be removed from the Constitution, and you'd have to go through the whole process again just to get the amendment back. So that would be just a ginormous, beyond ginormous can of worms and a terrible idea. So the policy has always been, if a state ratifies, they can't go back on it. But this is actually an issue that's affecting the United States right now. So there was an amendment proposed over 50 years ago, the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA very nearly made it. However, it was just a few states short. Then in 2020, 50 years after this amendment was proposed, the final states needed to reach 38 ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. Wahoo! Our 28th Amendment! But 5 states claim to have rescinded their ratification in the 1970s. 5 different states changed their mind and said we no longer ratify, and they claim they did this decades ago, which at the time they said they rescinded their ratification. But at that time, nobody could decide whether or not they were allowed to rescind their ratification. So you fast forward to 2020, and if they're allowed to rescind their ratification, then the ERA did not pass. But if they're not allowed, which has always been the policy, if they have to stick to their ratification, then we've got ourselves a 28th Amendment. So what do? Well, the government is still arguing about it. In 2020, things got kind of messy. 2021, this was brought up again. It's still kind of messy. And here in 2023, as of the time of recording, the Equal Rights Amendment is not an official constitutional amendment yet. There's a whole lot of argument that needs to take place, and they have to decide what to do about this question of, can a state ratify and then go back? So to show you in a picture the current status of this 28th Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, all the states in the pink have ratified it. States in yellow are the 3 states who ratified after the supposed deadline. That's another thing that's being argued, is whether or not there was actually a deadline for ratification. And then these states that are in the dark bluish black, those states ratified the amendment and then just a few years later revoked their ratification. But we don't know if they can actually do that or not. So there's a whole argument there. The states in gray have not ratified because they haven't approved it by their full state governments. They've approved it in one house of their government. And then the states in the purpley blue color have specifically not ratified. They're opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. So we looked at how constitutional change could happen by formal amendment, and the fact that there's 4 ways you can do that. But remember, there is another way constitutional change can happen, by other informal means. Let's take a look at what that means. So, informal amendment of the Constitution. Well, actually, it's kind of misleading to call it informal amendment. There is no informal way to officially change the written words of the Constitution. You can't do it. Anytime you're changing so much as a piece of punctuation in the Constitution, you've got to have all kinds of policies followed, and there's a whole lot of agreements that have to happen, and it's a lot of work. But the meaning of the Constitution, or in other words, the interpretation, can change over time even though the words remain the same. So how does that happen? Well, one way is Congress can add to the meaning of the Constitution by passing legislation. They can pass laws that sort of further interpret what the Constitution means when it says XYZ. The other way is the Supreme Court decisions set a judicial precedent by their interpretation of the Constitution. So the Supreme Court can make court decisions that are not necessarily related to a constitutional amendment, but that particular decision may later change how an amendment is interpreted. And so that is how we amend our Constitution. Hope you found that helpful.